The 1920s, known as the Roaring Twenties, was a very important time in history for America and the world altogether. The wealth in the U.S. more than doubled from year 1920 to 1929. People were using disposable income on things that they had normally grown at home or made at home. Clothing, dry goods, even meat and stuff was now being bought in stores, thanks to chain stores, which were new in the 20s, and also marketing. Marketing was new and coming in that era, and did a lot to help push some of these items for people to buy in store versus make or grow at home. Things that happened during this era, 1920 to 1929, shaped the world as we know it, and especially here in America, shaped a lot of things. One of the most important things I found in that era was women's rights. Women did not have a ton of rights before the 1920s, and still even throughout further decades gained more as we went along in time. But the women's suffrage movement as a whole started about 100 years prior to women gaining the right to vote. It was expected in the 1920s that women more focus on the home and children and just stay out of politics altogether. So the suffrage movement for women did a lot to help that. This is why women's right to vote was so groundbreaking in that time. But the women's suffrage movement in Britain in that time was a little more militant than the one here in the US at the time. The one in Britain, they would chain themselves to buildings, break windows, things like that. They were a lot more militant than we were for a while. Some of those tactics were adopted by the United States, the women's suffrage movement here. It did help them a little bit in some parts of the U.S. In others, there were hundreds of women jailed. Only few were actually tried, but a lot were jailed for at least a few days. Some spent months in prison over things like that, just being more militant. But finally, on August 18th, 1920, women were finally allowed to vote. Another important thing that I found from the 1920s was what's called mass media. We hear the media all the time, even today. When I think the media, I think news outlets or things like that, more in general, just news. But mass media back then was not as common as it is today. We can turn on our TV, our laptop, cell phone. It's just all over the place now. But then it was just the radio until the late 20s. Most families did have a radio. They would gather around at night and listen to the news, entertainment programs, and then music as well. But as far as mass media, it meant so much in that time to get your news. Most people had to wait weeks or months to stay updated on current events. So the radio back then was a big deal. It was the only way up until the late 20s where you could get your news and current events. The TV did come in the later 20s. It was 1927. It was invented by a man, and I may mispronounce his name, but Philo Taylor Farnsworth. He was a 21-year-old inventor. He was the first one to come up with the idea for the all-electric television. Those weren't common until another era, probably about 30s or 40s, was when TVs started becoming a household item, but it was invented in the 20s. The last thing I'll discuss here is the stock market crash. That was in the later 20s. It was 1929. The stock market crash happened on October 29th, 1929. It led to the longest economic downturn that the Western industrialized world had ever seen up till that point. The crash was primarily caused by low wages, a struggling agriculture department throughout the U.S., and then bank loans that could not be liquidated. Those were the three main causes for the stock market crash. But the stock market crash led to the Great Depression, which did start that year 1929, but it went all the way up until 1941, so it lasted a lot longer than the 20s. But 1920s was a big era in American history and just in world history. In general, things changed. The mass media helped everyone get news immediately. As soon as reporters or news outlets knew it, the people knew it. Political stances taken in the 1920s, innovation in media, and then just the hard times in general that people in the 1920s faced shaped who America is today, what we think, our worldview, and just the world in general. It shaped who we are today. But I enjoyed searching and reviewing things in this era. It was an interesting one. It's one I've always kind of been interested in, but I liked to learn a little bit more about it. Thank you for watching my video. I look forward to your all feedback.